4 June 1944 Atlantic Ocean, about 150 miles off Rio de Oro. The hunter-killer group around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal turns as one on a clean sound contact. Captain Daniel Gallery keeps the net clipped and dry. Destroyer escort USS Chatelain is already bow on screws, biting Hedgehog crews standing by. Below, U-505, under Oberleutnant Zur. C. Harald Lange holds to the old routine, change depth ride out the guesses live to nightfall. The first run is textbook and empty. A Kurt bearing a short, countdown 24 spigot bombs walk ahead of the bow and vanish without a single pop. No hit, no celebration, only the wheel coming over and the trace rebuilt. The second run arrives faster, bearings stay steady, a shallow pattern follows and the sea lifts and slams. In the control room, a bulb bursts and a man coughs iron. The boat is wounded and light pumps losing the argument. There are two choices left, drown slowly or blow tanks and breathe. U-505 rips through the surface in a roar of spray. Fighters from Guadalcanal rake the water to mark. Chatelain's guns stay tight on the casing, then fall silent on command. Men spill out of the conning tower, some leaping, some stumbling. The American voice on the circuit remains procedural. Cease, Hedgehog, keep her under observation. A boarding team forms without drama. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David will take the first step onto an enemy deck and begin stripping codebooks and the heart of the boat itself. 8 weeks earlier, north of Madeira on 9 April 1944 U-515, under Korvettenkapitan Werner Henke, had been worked the same way by this style of group until she surfaced wrecked and ended on the bottom. Different day, different hull, same procedure, same end. Oil sheen, hiss of steam, no music, only waves tapping a captured hull. In the early summer of 1944, between Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the stretch of water off the Rio de Oro, northbound and northwestbound convoys jostled with cogwheel escorts. The Allies needed uninterrupted sea lanes to gather fuel, ammunition, pontoons, vehicles, and medical supplies for a series of timed operations. Each slow day of a convoy meant a gap in the rear depots near the British coast and on the landing beaches to be opened. On paper, the U-boat threat was smaller than in previous hunting seasons. On the sea, the worry was undiminished. A sinking steel hull, carrying hundreds of containers, a route disrupted, a spreading column of black water and oil that could disrupt the supply of an entire army. The Germans still had ships, but their crews were running out of seasoned crews who had survived weeks in the North Atlantic. Engines were tired, batteries were flat, valves were jammed, human eyes and ears were more tired than their equipment. Yet they retained the psychological capital that had nourished so many victories. Night was their ally. The sea was noisy enough to hide a still hull. A rhythmic depth change would disrupt enemy estimates. In their memories, the early wartime charges often arrived late, fell behind, exploded in the water just empty when the ship had changed decks. That script saved lives, not anecdotes, and so it carried weight even when the fuel was depleted. For the Americans, the fear lies not in the overall statistics of the front, but in the small gaps, bad weather, swallowing a clean ping, an engine noise accidentally mixed with the propeller of an escort, a moment of inattention revealing the convoy's route when changing formation. They know a homing torpedo can slip into the water behind an escort. They know sensors can be fooled by false noise. They know that rough seas can distort the shallow or average setting of a series of charges. So, the fear here is not panic but rigor. If the process is loose at any link, a cargo hull will go to the bottom. The difference in the summer of 1944 was the dense presence of new types of hunting groups. A small escort aircraft carrier carrying an anti-submarine squadron, surrounded by a ring of destroyer escorts with sonar equipment, hydroacoustics, surface radar, and shallow-mounted weapons. The operating theory sounded dry as a manual, but it directly broke the old script instead of relying on luck to drop a series of charges behind a lost trail. The escorts kept the bearing with sonar and fired a series of weapons flying in an NDC arc launched in front of the bow. The weapon did not explode because of the timer. It waited for metal contact. If there was no explosion, it meant the first salvo had missed. The ship immediately opened the range, regained contact, and entered the attack axis again. The chain of actions could be repeated 3 or 4 times in the same water area. When physical signs such as oil slicks or air bubbles appear, shallow place charges reduce the submarine's options to surface, with a torn hull, or sink into darkness with a flooded compartment. While the land front pressed on German territory, the nerves of both sides at sea remained as taut as a taut rope. The German command continued to harbor the hope that a well-placed submarine could cut a convoy, throw off schedules, and thus prolong the rhythm of the war. A well-timed, successful strike could be turned into a bargaining chip. Sailors still trusted in the old routine because it had not betrayed them. In the early stages, listen to the propeller, mark the clock, change depth, lie still, let the burst pass, and then disappear to a new level. That confidence was not wishful thinking, it was skill. But that skill was beginning to meet a different kind of opponent-enemy routine. For hunting parties, no one waits for inspiration or bold breakthroughs. A clean contact is treated like a measurement: distance, direction, estimated speed, axis of approach, launch time. Silence, after the first salvo, means there is still a large error. It is necessary to separate, start over. If there is a single explosion of a warhead hitting the shell, the indicators are adjusted for re-entry. If the speed changes abnormally, the hypothesis of a change in depth is entered into the next command table. In a submarine cabin, these details are transformed into sounds. A light bulb vibrates and goes out. A gasket squeals the smell of battery acid, spreads the sound of water pouring into what used to be air. The script of let the salvo pass and live on is no longer tenable when the blow does not land behind but in front. The strategic context made the change carry weight beyond a single scene. Supply lines were under greater strain than ever before. The rear depots needed absolute regularity. If the hunter-killer failed to hold its bearings, if the sonar lost its track, and its weapons reverted to guessing mode, the U-boats would return to their role as stalkers in the opaque waters, and the war could drag on for months. All of blood. But if the axis of attack was closed according to the new plan and retaught, the tension was there. Both sides were exhausted, but one had a history of nights of escape, the other had the means to turn that history into useless habit. The Germans were not blind to reality. They knew that fuel, spare parts, and forward repair ports were shrinking. But the one thing harder to turn off than an oil gauge was fighting habit. The Americans were not delusional either. Rough seas could still chew up a good approach. A sonar torpedo could still follow the foam trail, and a mistake in depth setting could still ruin the entire attack. So each contact was a retest of whether the process was cold enough, clean enough, repeatable enough to push the enemy. By the end of June, reports from the seas noted a recurring pattern. Submarines still encountering hunter-killers rarely maintained the initiative through the second round of attacks. Not because they were worse than yesterday, but because what they were used to facing had changed. The enemy did not predict behind, but blocked in front. Did not strike with a timer, but waited for the metal to respond. From then on, the stakes for each side became brutally simple. Either the process remained and expanded, or the night sea would swallow another cargo hull. When the process caught up with the night, deterrence was no longer a weapon. It was. Before the Americans changed their tactics, the real strength of the U-boat lay in the escort's constant guessing and lateness. At night, the sea was as noisy as a giant factory. Propellers, wind, waves, foam, everything combined into a curtain of sound. When an escort had to pass over the top of the trail to drop a salvo of charges, it cut off its own hearing. In that blind spot, a U-boat captain ordered silence, changed depth, crawled to another layer of water. The salvo landed right where the ship had left off. The lights in the hold, vibrated fine dust from steel and paint, fell like mist. But the hull was still airtight. The pumps still overpowered the water. The depth gauges were steady at a new mark. That script, repeated throughout the early years, brought a cold calm to the crew. Just do it, T. The weakness of that script was revealed only when an opponent refused to guess. In the spring and early summer of 1944, hunting groups, with escort carriers in the middle, and a ring of destroyer escorts, turned pursuit into measurement. Sonar kept the bearings from breaking. The map of the glass table had a straight pencil line corrected where there was a deviation. Instead of passing over the target and scattering explosives behind, the escort turned its bow to set its attack axis, launching a series of contact mines that fell forward. Each warhead fell silent as a stone. exploding only when it hit the metal casing. No explosion meant a miss. No hit meant detaching from the axis, opening the loop, regaining contact, re-engaging. The human experience was different. On a destroyer Escort, the sonar room was sealed, and Cold the spotter was drawing the approach line. The commands were curt heading, range estimated speed, ready to launch. When the first salvo landed without a bang, no one was disappointed. It was just data. The rudder angled the engine, revved up, the pencil line on the glass panel was pulled back. When a single explosion sounded from below the surface, it wasn't the sound of a timer going off, it was the sound of steel on steel. On the same ship, the charges were ready to set shallow. If oil bubbles or a complicated depth indicated hull damage, the next salvo was tipped down to cut the selection. In a U-boat's hold, the transition from active to deadlocked took place in a matter of minutes. At first, everything was the same old. Routine orders to keep quiet, orders to change depths, the watch dropping to a new mark, the crew chief's mental countdown, mingling with the sound of water rolling over the hull. But when the bearing didn't disappear, the captain was forced to change floors again and again. Each time the ship left its mark, a bubble trail at the bow from a stuck valve, a streak of oil from an aging flange, a short hiss from a gasket. Those marks for a measuring system were anchor hooks. The next attack circle relied on them to tighten. A series of shallow charges crashed down the ship, jerked back, lights crackled, the smell of battery acid filled the nostrils. The sailor held onto the handrail, his tongue tasting metal. The depth gauge no longer held still as the crew wanted. It oscillated, dropped, then jumped. The pattern repeated itself several times in the stretch of water between Madeira and the Canary Islands. In the first 10 days of April, a heavy U-boat was forced through several rounds by escorts coordinated with aircraft from the escort carrier. With each round, the confidence level in the submarine's hold dropped a notch. The final surface was a mere survival reflex, no more brakes to pump in time, no more fresh air for another attempt. Above, planes marked their positions with bullets. Escorts, clamped in light fire, swept the deck to force men off the conning tower hatch. Not long before, another submarine was stopped off Madeira by the same group, with the bearing held through and physical traces appearing early in the second round. Small stories, different hull numbers, different dates, but the same rhythm, measuring, repeating. The key to American counterattacks lies not in thickness, speed, or firepower on paper, but in translating data into a vital advantage. At attack range, whoever has a good sight 3 seconds early is the one who survives. Sonar and pencil lines on the glass table ensure that the sight doesn't disappear when the ship changes floors. The weapon dropped in front of the bow eliminates any illusion of one beat late and you're dead. It covers the path the ship must take and only detonates when there's steel, so it doesn't clutter the sense with pointless explosions. Shallow charges, when used at the right time, make the remaining choice a straightforward two-way street surface to breathe or drown in the darkness. For U-boats, the strong zone lies where the enemy must guess, where the water is murky and noise swallows the line of hearing. But when a hunting group squeezes several rounds in a row on the same axis, that strong zone shrinks rapidly. Each new round adds data, increases the probability of hitting shells, speeds up the moment of script failure. From the escort's perspective, their own death zone lies in procedural errors, a shaky pencil line, a half-beat delay in a command, a wrong depth setting in a choppy sea. So the command voice on the ship's side sounds like a checklist. Capture, enter, launch, break, capture again, set, shallow mark. No big words, no genius, just strictness. The result was not a single glorious feat, but a pattern. When the opponent refused to guess and patiently repeated the same maneuver, the old evasion script no longer had any place. This was not luck. It was a procedure that could be repeated. The first sound in the hold was a murmur of water sounds, a distant propeller noise mixed with the waves, a familiar low rumble. The captain ordered silence. The helmsman gently adjusted the rudder. The depth gauge slid across the marks like a knife on wood. No one spoke much. The breath was short and salty, the smell of engine oil mixed with the smell of batteries. The valve door creaked. The chief engineer slapped the back of his hand on the valve stem to release it. The old script began to run, change depth, wait, listen, let the explosion fall behind and pass. That was how U-boats had survived. On the surface, the destroyer Escort's sonar room was lit by a narrow, cool, colorless light. The person in charge of the crayon stood next to the glass board. The bearing lines were straight, and any distortions were corrected. The watch officer's voice was even direction, distance, estimated speed. The order was given briefly to the deck, prepare to launch. A few seconds of silence, except for the sound of the engine revving up, then the dry sound of a series of bullets, leaving the barrel drawing invisible curves ahead. No one counted down aloud. Each person counted in their head. When the sea surface did not echo any explosions, the officer on duty said only 2 words, miss. The rudder changed angle, opened the loop, re-established contact. Below, the ceiling lights vibrated to the tired rhythm of the steel hull. The sounding board reported the propeller was returning faster than expected. The captain ordered a depth change again. The valve handle was slippery with moisture, and fingernails scratched the edge of the handrail to hold it firmly. The depth gauge approached a new mark and stopped. The order to hold still was given, and the whole cabin held its breath, waiting for the old series of explosions to pass as they always had. But the series of explosions did not come. The silence was not smooth. It was a directional silence, like a black shadow lying ahead. On the Escort, the pings were as regular as clockwork. The crayon retraced the attack line. The officer pointed to the new approach angle, his voice dry, hold this way. Double the RPM, wait for the launch window. The order was given to the shallow charges that they would wait for physical confirmation before swooping down. The second volley of weapons falling ahead was launched, the bodies on deck waiting in a neutral position. A single explosion answered from underwater, sounding like someone hammering a brass bell at the bottom. The lights in the submarine cabin went out, came back on, and then off again. A short hiss from the washers. The smell of battery acid spread quickly and sharply. The depth gauge, which had just stood still, suddenly oscillated, dropped slowly, then increased steeply, indicating that the body of the ship was being pushed off balance. The chief engineer said the pumps were losing power and needed to slow down further, but the sound of the hydrophone interrupted. The bearing had not dropped. Experience told everyone that when the bearing had not dropped, changing one more depth step might only leave a trail of bubbles. The captain hesitated for a second, then ordered another depth step. The depth steersman pushed the lever, his shoulders heavy with water, pouring into what had been air. The Escort continued to do exactly what was written on the checklist. The order to mark was passed to the escort squadron aircraft on the small aircraft carrier. The sound of a single engine roared across the water. A salvo of bullets blackened the sea at the submarine's bow, forcing anyone who emerged from the conning tower hatch later to duck close to the deck. Underwater, the sonar picked up a strange trace, a string of bubbles, possibly from a valve, possibly from an aging joint. The officer on duty gave a short command, shallow pattern. The man setting the charges didn't raise his head, still holding the depth gauge, double-checked, confirmed. The crash was short and heavy. The ship shook as if someone had pushed it across the side. Paint dust fell on the chief engineer's head, a dust that had no smell, but made his throat itch. A light bulb broke, glass rolled. A sailor slipped on the wet floor, his fingernails bleeding as he gripped the handrail. Water seeped through a metal vein, first as mist, then in a thin stream. The order rang out, check for flooding, keep quiet, try to add another step of depth. But depth was no longer something the crew could decide. The needle dropped and then jumped, the pump couldn't keep up. The chief engineer glanced at the captain, didn't say a word, just nodded. The last order was dry, and low blow the ballast. On the surface, the man with the binoculars barely had time to blink before he saw the submarine's bow peeking out from under the sea in a foaming cap. The shouts on the intercom didn't get louder. They maintained the same level of indifference. Stop weapons falling in front of the bow. Keep control. Fire. Don't fire at the hatches when the men surfaced. Planes overhead circled, dropping smoke grenades. Escort ships held their bow positions, their light guns pointed in the right direction, but stopped firing when they saw men pouring out of the turret hatches. The orders were clear: keep the target in sight, don't lose it. It all sounded like a chain. On the submarine, the deck was slick with oil and salt. The first men emerged from the hatch, crawling almost their hands before their knees. Their eyes were red from battery fumes, their skin glistening with steam and sweat. They did not look long. A glance around was enough to tell them whether they were dead or alive. Then they leaned toward the water's edge. One of them slipped, hit his shoulder against the edge, and gave a short, unending groan. Down below, the water was no longer cool. It was heavy as stone when a new body had fallen in. On the American side, the commanding voice continued to count the things that had to be done. Organize the boarding team, check the gunnery for safety, prepare the tow rope if the ship was still afloat. a warrant officer younger than the rest, repeated each item again, not out of doubt, but because it was the correct procedure. As the boat left the side, the man in the bow held the gun barrel down, his eyes still on the conning tower. In the air, the pilot glanced at the sight, pulled the stick lightly, the engine roared once, then slowed down when the threat was no longer needed. Time was stretched by the number of movements, not by emotion. The escort men took turns holding new bearings around the oil-drifting sub. The sonar men made final pencil adjustments. In the boats, the boarding team used rope ladders, hands gripping the edges, knees pushing against the steel to score points. They didn't speak in big sentences. They talked about where to tie the ropes, which hatches to open, which compartments to check for water levels first. When the first pair of boots hit the submarine deck, the men behind them briefly touched the men in front on the shoulder, not to cheer, but to remind them not to rush. In the submarine hold, the remaining men could hear the water above them, as if a ceiling had collapsed. The smell of acid was stronger. A faint hissing sound came from a corner of the hold, like a wounded man breathing. The captain looked up at the hatch, his hand on the metal, his eyes no longer free to think about tactics. He just chose the moment. When the hatch opened, the light stabbed into his eyes like a dull knife. The second step was more difficult than the first, because the floor had sloped. In that moment, the escort kept its original course. No closer, no looking away, no change of pace. On the deck of the escort ship, a young sailor changed the magazine but did not reload his gun. He picked up the receiver, said a few short sentences, and returned the receiver to the man next to him. At the bow, the man holding the loudspeaker continued his formulaic remarks, reminding everyone to keep their positions and not to step into another person's firing line. The ship's engine slowed down a notch. The hull shook less, and the waves crashing against the side became more audible. The boat was pressed against the submarine side. The line was caught on a pre-existing hook. The first man stepped through without looking back. His gloved hand touched the oiled steel, slid halfway, then held on. They moved as if in a factory, each one doing the right thing in the right position. When the first door to the hold opened, the smell of metal and acid hit him hot as smoke. One of the team whispered, "Check the documents, check the engine, close the valve." The answer was a flat yes. In the sky, the plane descended further, clearly seeing the bodies floating beyond the submarine's bow, clearly seeing the black dots on the escort's deck, moving in a pattern only they understood. The only sounds left on the sea surface were scattered sounds, water splashing on the deck, the sound of metal rubbing against wires, a man's long cough. All was audible because the inaudible had disappeared. No more guesswork explosions, no more blind spots as the ship passed over the target. When the first announcement of control of the sub was made, no one raised a hand to congratulate it. They simply adjusted their hats, added a line to their notebooks, and switched the communication channel to post-engagement mode. Another command came, like all the others: keep your distance, wait for orders to pull. The rudder turned slowly, and the hull circled like a compass around a fixed point. Underwater, all that remained of the old belief was a hollow feeling behind the left flank. Above water, the routine continued as before, without changing a word. No one told a story of the extraordinary. No one raised their voice. There was no need. As one ship was forced to breathe in the light, and another simply repeated the maneuver, it became clear that the only thing that remained true was the old evasive script, broken in the seconds between a ping and a single explosion. The post-battle report was typed that evening on the escort carrier. Time, position, bearing, direction not dropped in 2 rounds. First salvo fell in front of the bow silently. Next round, there was a single explosion placed. Shallow target emerged in an uncontrolled state. The report ended with a dry line procedure, confirmed repeatable. The document did not stay in the safe. The next morning, the group operations officer sent a 3-paragraph extract over the comm circuit to the escort ships in the group and to the anti-submarine training center. A short 2-sentence order was added to the checklist: if first salvo is silent, separate, regain contact, re-engage, only switch to shallow charges if there are physical signs. There was no speech in the mothership conference room. The squad leader tapped his pencil on the edge of the table, repeating the same 3 points: keep the bearing, strike from the bow, and place shallow when there was evidence. The sonar officer suggested adding a note to the planning form: silence after the first salvo was not a failure. It was data for correction. The weapons chief agreed to allocate more warheads and charges to squads with high loop rates, since measurement attrition was now part of the strategy, not considered a problem. On the pier behind the landing strip, The crew spread out a tarp and opened a crate of spare parts. A damaged thruster ring was replaced in 2 hours. 2 spare batteries for the sonar system were lifted up by hand crane. The warehouse manager recorded the batch number, ticking a plus sign in the arrival column. There were 2 more on the next trip. No one spoke of grand industrial terms. They just checked the rings, cables, lubricants, and sonar bulbs. That readiness made the risk acceptable. If the first round didn't hit, there would be a second, a third. If a warhead cluster failed, the crew would replace the launcher. If a ship had to dock quickly, there would be a four. In the anti-submarine class, the instructor stood next to the glassboard holding chalk. He wrote 3 lines: keep direction, hit the bow, slide silently. He drew a wax line representing a bearing on the model, then deliberately distorted it so that the students could correct it themselves. One student asked if they should risk placing shallow charges right after the first round to get ahead of the opportunity. The answer: don't risk it based on feeling. Only use shallow charges when physical signs confirm the target is injured. If there are no air bubbles, no oil stains, no unusual changes in acoustics, the next round will still be a series of falls in front of the bow. The whole class wrote in the notebook. A slide is: on the deck of a frigate in another group a few hundred miles away, the watchman read a short message from the system. It read a new SOP line in bold. The weapons captain nodded, took the sticker down to his post, pinned it to the wooden board next to the launcher. The attendants there were used to the new way of doing things. They didn't wait for the usual burst of explosions. They listened for a single blast. The chain of transmission from post-game report to checklist, to lecture, and back to the surface is swift, because each step is concise. On the surface, hunting groups use the same short language on the intranet: hold, course launch, split retrieve, contact set, shallow when marked. There is no need to mention the initiator by name. The credit goes to standardized practice. Everything is written in 2 to 5 word commands without adjectives. Each transition has a fixed duration. A young officer just transferred to a new team did exactly as his predecessor did because he did not. Behind that process was another decision rarely seen on camera: accepting risk as part of the way of fighting. The previous practice of firing a single salvo off the bow and then switching to deep charges was routine, saving time and ammunition. Now the commander authorized 2, even 3 silent salvos in succession if the bearings held and the seas permitted. Those empty seconds weren't empty. They were the cost of buying data. The back-end industry, from the destroyer escort assembly line to the spare parts warehouse, absorbed the cost. A worn-out launch rail would be replaced. A batch of mistimed warheads would be scrapped without regret. A ship forced into dock early would have another one come out. On the German side, the decision-making chain was forced to reverse. Each veteran submarine was an irreplaceable asset. Each crew that sailed 3 or 4 campaigns was a mobile storehouse of experience. Tight fuel budgets forced them to count every hour of operation. Forward repair ports were scarce and vulnerable. So American-style risk-taking was not an option. A loss report did not trigger a series of force-wide checklist changes for the week. It usually led to orders: to avoid the hunting group's area of operation, to avoid surfacing during the day, and to limit joint attacks if not possible. Each loss of a veteran submarine meant the loss of a teacher for the next generation. In the staff room of an escort squadron, the person in charge of compiling the report wrote a short statistic. The frequency of bearings holding for 2 turns increased the percentage of targets surfacing before the 3rd turn increased. Those numbers went into a memo sent up to the fleet level. The landing orders were also short: maintain the new approach, convert it to standard school exercises, update the reporting form to track specific physical signs before landing. Each change was a line added to the paper, not a speech. The dock workers receive a new order list: gaskets, cables, depth gauges, sonar bulbs, engine oil, anti-vibration rubber, all are packed into crates in batches. One ship comes into port, another sets sail. The cycles here are as short as a breath. When the captain returns to the group 3 weeks later, the deck checklists have been crossed out and the sailors. In Germany, a veteran captain received new orders: avoid areas with escort carriers. If forced to overtake, do so only at night and not for long. If contact with a hunting group is made, prioritize escape over attack. He jotted down a short word in his notebook: avoid. There were no spare parts to replace a broken gasket at sea. No engineering team deep enough to turn around quickly at dock. No reserve crew to cover for lost men. The only strength was habit, and that habit was being redefined by the enemy. The day after the new SOP was issued, another hunting party made contact in a different stretch of water. The first round was silent. Round 2 had a single explosion. Oil and gas traces appeared. Shallow charges were placed. The target surfaced controlled. The post-game report contained 3 sentences identical to the previous document. Different signatories, different ships, different weather. Same procedures. The citation returned to school. One line on the checklist was underlined in bold. The difference between the two sides was not individual courage or ingenuity. It was how the system handled information and risk. The Americans turned each miss into a piece of data, allowing attrition to be exchanged for higher probabilities in the next round, and had the resources to repeat it on a large scale. The Germans were forced to reduce their exposure, preserve their rareness, avoid risk, and each loss report pushed them a little further from the initiative. When one side played like a chain, and the other kept it like a museum keeper, the result was not a single brilliant victory, but by the end of June, the trainers added a sentence to the board: "Don't expect miracles, expect routine." The warehouse manager ordered another batch of warheads and gaskets. The sonar technician wiped the glass panel and replaced the bulb. The team leader signed an updated order, folded the paper, and put it in his pocket. Outside, the sea was still rough. The wind was still whipping up white foam, and the ping was still ticking like a clock. When everything was in order, there was no more laughter at the blind charges being dropped behind. On the seas that summer, what ended a legend was not a single blow, but hundreds of small movements repeated on dozens of ships. The Americans began to strike like a chain. The Germans had to hold on like a fish. The silence after the first salvo was not peace. It was the gap that signaled that the attack had landed in front of the bow and missed, and the listening direction was still like a compass needle. In the submarine's hold, the chief engineer watched the depth needle jump wildly. The hydrophone said, "Lowly bearings remain." The captain swallowed his words as he ordered another depth change. The valve handles were dry, the gaskets hissed. The smell of battery acid thickened like smoke. The old script still tried to run: silence, change depth, wait for the after salvo. But this time the silence was a silence with memory. It carried the coordinates for the next round to tighten. On the destroyer Escort, the crayon traced the approach axis. Open and regain. The rudder angle changed. The RPM increased by half a notch. The ping was steady as a clock. The order was short: ready the second salvo. No one expected a rush of explosions. They waited for the dry sound of steel on steel. When it struck from the bottom, the deck moved like a well-trained machine. Shallow pattern. The depth charge man checked twice without glancing up. The tracer plane descended its bullet belt, drawing a black line on the water. At the bottom, the light bulb flickered and then went out. Water dripped from a vein, first as mist, then as a thin stream. The depth gauge dropped and then bounced back like a pulled string. The chief engineer reported the pump was dead. The hydrophone repeated, bearing not falling. The old script fell apart. Changing depth left bubbles, oil leaks, strange sounds. Each trace drew the attack circle closer. The final command came out like a breath: blow the ballast. Light poured down through the hatch. The deck was slick with oil. The first man to surface did not raise his head for more than a beat. That same week, another hunting party in a stretch of water a few hundred miles away also encountered a hard contact. The first round was silent. The second round had a single explosion. Oil trails rose like torn ink. Charges set shallow. The target teetered, held down by light, fire, and smoke. Radios on both sides of the ocean broadcast the same phrases: hold course, launch, break away, regain contact, set shallow when there was evidence. Scenes changed. Procedures remained the same. Different hull, same outcome, same sequence of operations. On the staff table, the post-battle report was reduced to a 2-sentence order. A new underline appeared in the checklist: silence, after a series of drops in front of the nose, equals miss. Miss equals data. Open the loop and re-enter. Another line specified the shallow setting condition only if there were physical traces or suitable acoustic complications. The drafter signed, timed, and passed it on. In the training class, the instructor wrote in chalk, "The Hedgehog doesn't threaten, it measures." The trainees repeated it aloud as if it were memorized. From that night on, the change depth and wait for the series to explode trick was crossed out in the column of things not to do when the bearing is held. On the other side, the orders to the German crews changed in tone. Avoid areas with escort carriers. If contact is made with the hunters, prioritize escape. Shorten the time to surface. Do not pursue when repeatedly held on course. A penciled note appeared in the captain's notebook, avoid being hit in the bow. The words were short but cut into habit like a dull knife. What had once saved a crew's life now became forbidden when the enemy refused to guess and repeat like a machine. The collapse of the myth does not require speech. It is manifested in small gestures, a crayon drawing a straight line on the glass board, a finger touching a shallow ruler, a command cease hedgehog resounding evenly as the target rises without adding a tone. It is also manifested in the human body, fingernails bleeding from gripping the handrail, eyes red from battery fumes, a long cough on the oil deck. Before, silence was a sign of life. Now, silence is the desired result of the first round, so that the second round will be accurate. Before, changing depth was an invisibility cloak. Now, changing depth is a chalk line. Over the next week, the behavior shifted. The hunters increased the number of loops that legitimized miss equals data, freeing up more ammunition and time for measurements. U-boats reduced collisions, avoided hunter-killer zones, and left water when held on course. The deterrent power of darkness plus change of depth was recolored into a burden of preservation, keeping crew, keeping hull, keeping another chance in another stretch of water. On the American side, the fear of submarines did not disappear. It was modularized into checklist items. On the German side, the old belief did not dissolve immediately. It contracted into a narrow circle around a void. The 3 steps of the braking sequence became so obvious they could be read backwards, holding the gauge with a bearing that wouldn't drop, using a weapon that matched the gauge with a falling blow before the tip exploded on contact, forcing the decision with shallow pressure and control on the face. Each completed round pushed the old script back a step. There was no magic punch, just cold patience. By the end of the month, the short sentences were nailed into the notebook. Bearings don't fall. Changing depths is no longer an invisibility cloak. A single explosion is enough to know the old script is broken. Survival is about getting out of the attack circle. On the seas that summer, the laughter over the blinding charges faded. What remained was sonar keeping course and ships being boxed in, forced to breathe in the light. The very night after the battle, the report was reduced to 2 commands, sent around the escort team and back to the training school. Silence after a series of drops in front of the bow meant a miss. A miss was data. Open the loop and re-enter the shaft. The shallow setting condition was clearly stated only if there were physical traces or suitable acoustic complications. On deck, an extra line was pasted on the checklist. Before the shift, the checklist reader slowly repeated each word as if counting the beat. Hold course, launch separate, regain contact, shallow setting when there was evidence. In the spare parts warehouse, gaskets, sonar bulbs, depth gauges, and spare launchers were signed for and packed for the next trip. On deck of the Escort aircraft carrier, the anti-submarine squadron received a new supply of tracer ammunition. The worker cleaned the site, replaced a burned-out bulb. Over the next week, the AARs repeated themselves, first round silent, round 2 with a single explosion. Traces of oil or foam, shallow charges pushing up surface control with light fire and traces of smoke. The numbers in the staff room showed a marked increase in the rate of second rounds with single explosions. The anti-submarine school lecture was immediately revised. The instructor wrote in chalk, "Hedgehog doesn't threaten it. Measures." Then set up a glass tabletop simulator, forcing the students to practice the open and regain maneuver until they lost their minds. Another hunting group several hundred miles away radioed the same thing. Hold course, launch, release shallow. The scenery changed, the procedure remained the same. On the other side, the orders sent to the submarine crew changed to a cold tone, avoid areas with escort carriers. If contact is made with the hunting group, prioritize escape. Shorten the time to surface. Do not cling when being held continuously. The captain wrote in pencil in his notebook, avoid being hit in the bow. The experienced crew was withdrawn from the line for safety. Fuel repair docks, spare parts were all in short supply. The legend of changing depths and waiting for the series of explosions to pass fell out of the survival tips list. It became taboo when the enemy refused to guess and repeat like a machine. The psychology of both sides thus changed. With escorts, the fear of submarines did not disappear. It was modularized into a checklist. Silence after the first salvo was no longer a tense moment, but an indicator of waiting for the next round. A young officer underlined miss equals data in the two-sentence command and put it in his pocket. For submarine crews, the power of the night shrank to a burden of preservation, keeping the men, keeping the hull, keeping another chance in another stretch of water. Survival meant getting out of the attack circle, not waiting for the salvo to pass. The technical legacy of the summer range lies in the threshold of movement from bow drop to shallow lay must be based on measurable physical signs. Aircraft coordinate marking and control on the surface becomes a default step in the chain. Small but dense changes tilt the graph in one direction. Each new round increases the probability of hitting the hull. Each new escort enters the sea with the same language. In the escort handbook, silence is renamed data. In the submarine handbook, depth change loses its magic. If the hunting parties with this SOP had been denser 3 or 4 months earlier, would the darkness plus change depth still have been enough of a deterrent in the stretch of water between Madeira and the Canary Islands? Was the change depth still technically correct, or was it lost because the opposing system refused to guess and used slip as a yardstick? These questions do not need to be answered immediately. They keep the reader interested because the next wave is waiting. Next, still on the same invisible box axis, how an escort aircraft carrier shrinks the Atlantic with its eyes, ears, and a squadron sitting right on the deck, turning the space between two wind islands into a trap as simple as a checklist. On the sea that summer, the pings were as regular as clockwork. On deck, the checklist grew thicker. In the notebook across the street, a pencil scratched an arrow away from the hit area ahead. Sonar held course, and the laughter over depth charges had died down.